Since you could not give us an heir, this marriage is over, my father-in-law declared, sliding a thick manila folder across the Thanksgiving table. When I opened it, divorce papers stared back at me. I looked at my husband. He just stared at his wine glass. Silently, I signed every page. Then my best friend stood up and handed my father-in-law a brown envelope. The color drained from his face as he read what was inside. True story. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old, and until that moment, my in-laws thought I was just a lowly freelance bookkeeper they could bully and discard. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The clinking of fine crystal glasses had barely stopped echoing in the dining room of the Kensington family estate in Massachusetts. We gathered for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner in a sprawling mansion worth over $4 million. The table was laden with imported flowers, silver platters, and an elaborate feast prepared by a private chef. But the atmosphere was not festive. The air in the room was suffocatingly tense. Richard Kensington, my domineering father-in-law and CEO of a luxury supply chain company, stood at the head of the table. He wore his tailored suit like armor, projecting the image of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. He did not ask for my attention. He demanded it. Without warning, he tossed a thick manila folder across the long mahogany table. He threw it with such force that it crashed into my water goblet. The heavy crystal tipped over, spilling icy water directly onto my lap and staining the pristine white tablecloth. Nobody offered me a napkin. Nobody gasped or moved to help. They just watched me like predators circling wounded prey. Richard looked down his nose at me, his face twisted in a mask of pure contempt. The silence in the room was deafening as he delivered his opening blow. "Since you could not give us an heir, this marriage is over," he stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Sign the papers and be out of my house by morning." I felt my heart pound against my ribs, but I forced my face to remain completely neutral. I slowly turned my gaze to Preston, the man I had been married to for 5 agonizing years. He was 35 years old, a grown man by any standard, yet sitting there in his cashmere sweater, he looked exactly like a cowardly, scolded child. I waited for him to say something. I waited for him to defend our marriage, to defend me against his tyrannical father. Instead, Preston refused to even make eye contact with me. He kept his head bowed, swirling the dark red Cabernet in his wine glass, as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was spineless, obsessed with his inheritance, perfectly willing to let his family emotionally abuse his wife, rather than stand up for what was right. Seeing Preston cower in silence, my mother-in-law Beatrice decided it was her turn to strike. She leaned forward across the table, a vicious, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She deliberately adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, a gesture she always used, to remind me of the massive wealth gap between her family and my origins. "Do not bother looking at him for help, Natalie." Beatrice sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Preston has finally come to his senses and realized his catastrophic mistake. We warned him from the beginning about marrying a glorified calculator from a mediocre middle-class neighborhood. We told him you would bring nothing of value to the Kensington legacy." I sat perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me without reacting. Beatrice continued, her tone growing even more malicious with every syllable. "You had one job in this family. You were supposed to provide a Kensington heir to carry on our name and our empire. Instead, you have proven to be nothing but a barren gold digger who failed her only real duty as a wife. You have drained our son of his youth and brought us nothing but embarrassment in our social circles. We are done funding your pathetic life. Take the settlement we graciously offered in those papers, pack your cheap bags, and go back to whatever miserable town you came from." Sitting directly across from me was Jamal Washington, Preston's brother-in-law. Jamal was married to Preston's sister Caroline. As a 40-year-old African-American man who used to work as an IRS tax auditor and now served as a corporate compliance officer, Jamal was the only person in this toxic family who possessed a shred of rational thought and integrity. He watched the scene unfold with a deep frown, disgusted by their cruelty, but he remained quiet, his sharp eyes observing the legal documents on the table. Right beside me sat Naomi, my best friend, and a razor-sharp corporate attorney. I brought her as my guest to this Thanksgiving dinner specifically because I knew this ambush was coming. The Kensingtons thought Naomi was just another working-class nobody I dragged into their elite circle. They had no idea she was my heavily armed legal shield. I looked back down at the spilled water soaking into the folder. The divorce papers were getting completely wet, but the bold print of their cruel legal demands was still perfectly legible to everyone. They wanted to discard me with absolutely nothing, blaming me entirely for our lack of children, and assuming I would leave quietly in shame. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They foolishly assumed that I was just a defenseless, naive bookkeeper. They had absolutely no idea who they were really messing with or what was going to happen next. The silence in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. Everyone stared at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They expected tears. They expected me to beg for another chance to plead for my marriage or to grovel for a meager financial settlement. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malicious anticipation, practically salivating at the prospect of my humiliation. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath and let a cold wave of absolute calm wash over me. I reached into my leather handbag resting beside my chair and pulled out a heavy black fountain pen. The metallic click of the cap being removed echoed sharply across the room. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word of protest or defense. I simply pulled the damp manila folder closer to me, opened it to the first page of the divorce decree, and smoothed out the wrinkled paper. I pressed the nib of the pen to the signature line and began to write. The scratching sound of my pen filled the massive space. Page after page, clause after clause, I signed my name away. I signed away my rights to spousal support. I signed away any claim to the Kensington family estate. I signed away the 5 years I had spent trying to make this toxic marriage work. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting off my shoulders. I was not signing a surrender. I was signing a declaration of independence. Preston finally looked up from his wine glass, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief as he watched my hand move across the documents. He had braced himself for a hysterical screaming match. My utter silence unnerved him completely. I flipped to the final page, signed my name with a flourish, and pushed the folder back across the table toward the center. It was done. Richard let out a booming, arrogant laugh that shook his chest. He grabbed his crystal goblet and raised it in the air. "That is the smartest thing you have ever done in your entire life, Natalie," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "You finally recognized your place and accepted defeat." Beatrice clapped her hands together lightly, a gesture of pure, unfiltered snobbery. "Good riddance," she sneered, looking at me as if I were a stain on her expensive rug. Preston exhaled a loud, cowardly sigh of relief, his posture relaxing as he sank back into his plush dining chair. He actually smiled, looking over at his father, seeking approval like an obedient dog. They all exchanged triumphant, arrogant glances. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the useless, infertile daughter-in-law without spending a single dime in a legal battle. They were practically ready to pop open a bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate my departure. They did not even notice Naomi moving until she was already standing. My best friend pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She smoothed down her tailored pencil skirt and adjusted her blazer with an air of absolute authority. Naomi had sat quietly through the entire dinner, enduring their snide remarks and elitist microaggressions without a single complaint. The Kensingtons had completely ignored her, treating her like an invisible peasant who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as them. They had no clue she was a high-powered corporate litigator who destroyed arrogant billionaires for a living. Naomi picked up her large tote bag from the floor and pulled out a thick, heavy brown envelope sealed with red wax. She held it firmly in her right hand and began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the extravagant Thanksgiving table. The rhythmic click of Naomi's heels against the floorboards drew every eye in the room. Richard stopped mid-laugh, his bushy eyebrows pulling together in a deep, irritated scowl. Beatrice glared at Naomi, her nose wrinkled in utter disgust. "Excuse me, young woman." Beatrice snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. "What exactly do you think you are doing? Dinner is over. It is time for you and your friend to leave our property." Naomi completely ignored the matriarch. She did not even turn her head to acknowledge the insult. She kept her eyes locked dead onto Richard, her expression as cold and unyielding as a glacier. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly realizing that this situation was rapidly spinning completely out of their control. Jamal sat up straighter, leaning forward with intense curiosity, his analytical mind sensing the massive shift in the power dynamic. Naomi stopped right next to Richard at the head of the table. She stood tall, looking down at the arrogant patriarch. He glared up at her, his face flushing red with indignation at her sheer audacity. Before he could open his mouth to bark an order or call for his security staff, Naomi lifted her arm and dropped the heavy brown envelope directly onto his plate. It landed with a loud, wet smack, splashing brown gravy and cranberry sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth and ruining his perfectly carved slice of Thanksgiving turkey. Richard jerked back in his chair, his eyes bulging with rage. "How dare you!" he roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses. "What is the meaning of this insolence? Who do you think you are?" Naomi did not flinch at all. She leaned down slightly, resting her hands on the edge of the table, bringing her face mere inches from his. "I am the person who is going to ruin your entire year, Richard," she stated, her voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the gravy-stained envelope sitting on his ruined dinner. "Before you celebrate, you need to read what is in there." Richard angrily ripped it right open, and the red color instantly drained completely from his pale face. Richard stared at the thick stack of papers he had just pulled from the gravy-stained envelope with shaking hands. The bold black letters at the top of the first page made him tremble violently. He blinked hard, as if trying to clear his vision, but the reality of the document remained unchanged. Naomi reached down, snatched the top packet right out of his quivering fingers, and held it up for the entire table to see. She turned her gaze toward my cowardly husband, who was now sweating profusely in his expensive cashmere sweater. "This," Naomi announced, her voice ringing with absolute clarity, "is Preston Kensington official and highly confidential medical file." Beatrice gasped aloud, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "How did you get that?" she demanded, her voice shrill with sudden panic. "That is private property. You have no right to bring my son's health records to the Thanksgiving table." Naomi ignored the matriarch and slammed the file down right in front of Preston. His face was completely ashen. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor. I decided it was time to break my silence. I pushed my chair back and stood up, looking directly at the man who had promised to love and protect me. For 3 agonizing years, I started my voice dangerously steady. I allowed doctors to treat my body like a science experiment. I endured hundreds of invasive hormone injections. I woke up every single morning at the crack of dawn to jab needles into my stomach until my skin was covered in dark purple bruises. I suffered through violent mood swings, debilitating cramps, and the constant crushing heartbreak of every failed cycle. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the lavish dining room. Beatrice looked slightly uncomfortable but maintained her haughty glare. Richard was still staring blankly at the remaining papers in the envelope. Jamal was watching Preston with narrowed eyes, his analytical mind already piecing the ugly puzzle together. And through all of that physical and emotional torture, I continued, my voice growing colder. "You sat there and watched me cry on the bathroom floor. You held my hand while your mother called me barren. You stayed completely silent, Every single time Beatrice hosted a family dinner and loudly lamented that I was too defective to carry the precious Kensington bloodline. You let your father slide divorce papers across this very table tonight, blaming me for our lack of an heir. Preston finally looked up, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Natalie, please, he begged, his voice cracking pitifully. You do not understand. I was scared. I did not know how to tell you. I did not know how to tell them. Tell them what? Beatrice snapped, finally losing her patience. Preston, what is this woman talking about? You are perfectly healthy. You were a varsity athlete. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. She is just trying to deflect the blame because her body is broken. Naomi let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through Beatrice's arrogant rant. Your daughter-in-law is not broken, Beatrice, Naomi stated, pointing a manicured finger directly at Preston's pale face. Your son is. Naomi picked up the medical file and began reading the highlighted sections out loud for the entire room to hear. Patient Preston Kensington, age 35. Diagnosis confirmed by 3 separate specialists. Non-obstructive izoospermia. The medical term hung in the air. Richard looked up, confusion mixing with the growing horror on his face. What the hell does that mean? He demanded, slamming his fist onto the table. Speak plain English, lawyer, Jamal answered before Naomi could. It means total male infertility, Richard Jamal said, his deep voice carrying across the silent room. I have seen cases like this before in my compliance work. It means Preston produces absolutely zero viable sperm. He is completely sterile. It is a biological impossibility for him to ever father a child naturally or through conventional in vitro fertilization. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless sound and collapsed back into her chair. She stared at her precious son as if he had just grown a second head. No, she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, that cannot be true. The doctors said Natalie was the problem. The doctors said her egg quality was too poor. The doctors never said that I corrected her, feeling a fierce sense of vindication. Preston said that. Preston went to the private consultations alone to hear the test results. Preston came home and told me the doctors blamed my biology. He lied to me. He lied to you. He lied to everyone. Naomi flipped to the second page of the medical file and held it up. And here is the truly sick part, Naomi added, her voice dripping with pure disgust. Look at the date on this official diagnosis, Richard. Look closely. Richard squinted at the paper, his eyes widening as he read the date. 4 years ago, he read aloud, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. This diagnosis is from 4 years ago. Exactly, I said, staring unblinkingly at the pathetic excuse for a man sitting across from me. You always knew the truth, Preston. You knew 4 entire years ago that you were completely sterile. You received this diagnosis a full year before we even started our incredibly painful and expensive fertility treatments. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over the room. Preston had knowingly allowed me to destroy my body with heavy hormones and invasive surgeries for 36 consecutive months. He had watched me inject myself daily, fully aware that there was zero chance of conception. He had let me carry the crushing burden of guilt, believing I was failing our marriage, failing him, and failing his family. He happily let his elitist, narcissistic parents emotionally abuse me, protecting himself. Preston slammed his hands flat against the solid mahogany table, the sudden violence of his movement rattling the heavy crystal and expensive silverware. He sprang to his feet, his dining chair scraping violently backward before tipping over completely and crashing onto the expensive Persian rug. His face had rapidly morphed from pale, sweating terror into a vibrant, blotchy crimson mask of pure rage. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Naomi, small droplets of spit flying from his trembling lips as he began to scream at the top of his lungs. You cannot do this! He roared, his voice cracking under the sheer, unadulterated panic of finally being exposed. This is a massive, unprecedented violation of federal law. You stole my highly private medical history. I am going to sue you for absolutely everything you own. I will personally ensure that the State Bar Association strips you of your legal license. I will have you disbarred and ruined for this stunt. This is a direct, flagrant violation of my strict privacy rights under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. You cannot just march into my private family home on a holiday and illegally distribute my highly confidential privileged medical files to everyone sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I will call my legal team right now. I will see you in federal court by Monday morning. I will destroy your entire career. Naomi did not even blink at his unhinged, frantic outburst. She stood with her feet planted firmly on the floor, her posture radiating total confidence and supreme legal authority. She reached down, picked up her wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine before setting it back down. She looked at Preston with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity mixed with absolute disdain. Preston, you really should consult a competent attorney before you start screaming about federal statutes you clearly do not understand. Naomi advised, her voice eerily calm and perfectly measured against his hysterical screaming. First of all, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act applies strictly to medical providers, insurance companies, and healthcare clearinghouses. I am none of those things. I am a private citizen and a corporate litigator representing my client. I did not hack into a hospital database to acquire those records. Those documents were legally subpoenaed as discovery evidence in your impending highly contested divorce proceeding. You see, when a husband actively conceals a total infertility diagnosis from his wife and then knowingly allows her to undergo years of physically destructive, financially draining fertility treatments while simultaneously letting his family berate her for failing to conceive, that is not just a little white lie. That constitutes severe marital fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and egregious financial abuse. Naomi leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, her dark eyes locking onto Preston's terrified gaze. You handed Natalie divorce papers tonight to throw her out on the street, but those legal documents you slid across the table just opened the door for a massive civil lawsuit. Natalie is fully within her rights to sue you for the entire cost of the medical procedures, plus punitive damages for the sheer psychological torture you deliberately inflicted upon her. So please, Preston, go ahead and call your lawyers. I would absolutely love to hear what they have to say about defending a man who committed egregious marital fraud just to protect his fragile male ego. Beatrice could not handle the horrifying reality unfolding in front of her. Her deeply ingrained narcissism immediately went into aggressive, hostile overdrive. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands down on the table, her expensive diamond rings clicking loudly against the polished wood. Lies. Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the massive dining room. These are nothing but vicious, fabricated lies. My son is perfect. My son comes from the strongest, healthiest genetic lineage in this entire state. You forged these disgusting documents, Natalie. You sat in your little rented office typing away on your computer, creating fake hospital records just to ruin my perfect son, because you could not handle the simple fact that your own body is a useless, barren wasteland. You are a manipulative, desperate liar. Beatrice pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. You planted this fake evidence because you knew Richard was finally throwing you out of our prestigious family tonight. You wanted to humiliate Preston in front of his father, to extort a massive divorce settlement. Well, it is not going to work, you pathetic little gold digger. We will hire the best legal defense team in the entire country to prove you fabricated every single word written on those pages. The argument reached an absolute fever pitch. Richard, still clutching the medical files tightly in his hands, stared down at the official hospital letterhead. His sharp, calculating business mind recognized the undeniable authenticity of the documents. The watermarks were real. The physician's signatures were completely genuine. Richard looked up at Preston, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of profound disappointment and rising anger. Preston saw his father analyzing the irrefutable truth, and sheer panic completely overtook him. Driven by pure desperation, Preston lunged across the wide Thanksgiving table. He knocked over a large silver platter of roasted vegetables, sending hot food flying everywhere as he frantically tried to physically snatch the medical papers right out of his father's hands. "Give those back to me!" Preston screamed, his voice breaking wildly as he clawed at the documents. "They are fake. She is lying. Give them back right now." Richard forcefully shoved his son backward, refusing to let go of the revealing papers. The sheer desperate physical struggle between the frantic father and son sent more heavy wine glasses shattering on the hardwood floor. The chaotic violence in the dining room escalated to a terrifying, uncontrolled crescendo, making the Thanksgiving dinner look like an absolute war zone. The chaotic violence in the dining room escalated to a terrifying crescendo, making the dinner look like an absolute war zone. Suddenly, a sharp chime echoed through the cavernous hallways of the mansion. The front doorbell rang its cheerful tune, slicing directly through the violent shouting and breaking crystal. The effect on my cowardly husband was instantaneous. Preston froze, completely releasing his desperate grip on the medical documents. The aggressive energy drained entirely out of his body in a single second, replaced by a paralyzing terror. He staggered backward, his eyes darting wildly toward the grand archway leading to the marble foyer. He knew exactly who was standing on the other side of those heavy oak doors. The hired domestic staff, oblivious to the nuclear meltdown occurring in the dining room, dutifully answered the door. The distinct rhythmic clicking of high heels against the imported Italian marble floor grew steadily louder, echoing down the corridor. Everyone at the ruined Thanksgiving table turned their head toward the archway. Beatrice stopped her hysterical hyperventilating, wiping a smear of spilled gravy from her silk blouse. Richard stood frozen, clutching the crumpled medical diagnosis in his fist. Jamal leaned back calmly, crossing his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on the entrance with profound analytical interest. I simply remained standing exactly where I was, my posture relaxed, waiting for the final piece of my carefully orchestrated trap to fall perfectly into place. A young woman stepped confidently into the archway, destroying whatever dignity the Kensington family had left. It was Brittany. She was 25 years old, naive and driven by greedy ambition. She wore a tight burgundy velvet dress entirely inappropriate for a formal family holiday dinner, but it served its intended purpose perfectly. The clinging fabric hugged every curve of her body, highlighting her noticeably rounded stomach. She was visibly 4 months pregnant, her maternal state impossible to deny. She stood there surveying the wreckage of the dining room, the overturned chairs, the spilled wine soaking into the expensive rugs, and the furious faces of my in-laws. Yet in her profound ignorance, she misinterpreted the hostile atmosphere. She assumed the violent chaos was simply the messy aftermath of my scheduled dismissal. She smiled a bright, sickeningly sweet expression of pure victory. "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone," Brittany announced, her cheerful voice ringing out across the silent room. She stepped further into the dining area, acting as if she already owned the estate. "Preston, baby, your phone was going straight to voicemail. I could not wait out in the car any longer. It is freezing outside and I wanted to be here to celebrate." Preston looked like he was about to vomit onto the Persian rug. He raised his hands, shaking them frantically, trying to silently signal her to shut her mouth and leave. "Brittany, stop!" He choked out his voice, a pathetic squeak. "You need to leave right now. Get out. Go back to the car. We cannot do this right now." But Brittany completely ignored his desperate warnings. She was far too enamored with her own grand entrance and perceived elevation into high society. She walked right past him, her heels crunching on broken glass, and turned her arrogant gaze directly toward Beatrice and Richard. She flashed them a perfectly rehearsed smile. "I know this is a surprise," Mr. and Mrs. Kensington, Brittany cooed, stepping up to the ruined table. "But Preston promised me that today was the day. He promised me he was finally ripping the Band-Aid off and dumping his infertile wife so we could be a real proper family. He said he was having her sign the divorce papers tonight so we could finally stop hiding. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Richard stood as still as a statue, his eyes darting from Brittany, smiling face to Preston's sweating terror. I watched the scene unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. Brittany had willingly handed me the final nail for their coffin. She walked over to Preston, oblivious to the fact that he was literally trembling with fear, and linked her arm through his. She leaned her head against his shoulder, projecting the image of a devoted partner who had just rescued him from a miserable, joyless marriage. I am incredibly relieved it is finally over. Brittany continued, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she shot a pitying glare in my direction. Preston has been miserable for years dealing with the crying and failed medical treatments. A man of his stature needs a woman who can actually fulfill her basic biological duties. He deserves a woman who can give him the life he is supposed to have. She turned back to Richard and Beatrice, her smile widening into an expression of profound, arrogant triumph. She deliberately unlinked her arm from Preston, took a step back, and placed both hands lovingly over her pronounced swollen belly. She proudly rubbed the fabric of her tight velvet dress, drawing every single eye in the room directly to her 4-month pregnancy. You do not have to worry about your family legacy fading away anymore. Mr. Kensington, Brittany bragged, her tone completely saturated with entitlement and absolute certainty. Preston and I are going to give you exactly what you have been waiting for. I am carrying the next generation. I am carrying the true Kensington heir. The crushing silence that followed her grand declaration was heavier than lead. Brittany stood there beaming brightly, expecting the wealthy matriarch and patriarch to rush forward, embrace her, and welcome her into their elite family with open arms and open checkbooks. She expected them to weep with joy at the prospect of finally having a grandchild to carry on their prestigious name. She fully anticipated that they would praise her for succeeding where I had so miserably failed. Instead, they just stared at her in total, horrified silence. Preston looked like his soul had left his physical body. He was trapped in a nightmare of his arrogant creation. He stood frozen between the devastating medical file proving his absolute infertility, still clutched tightly in his angry father's shaking hands, and the proud, smiling mistress rubbing her pregnant belly in the doorway. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to try to spin another pathetic lie, but no words came out. He just let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, a sound of total, humiliating defeat. The tension in the dining room mounted to an agonizing level, setting the perfect stage for the inevitable, brutal collapse of his entire miserable existence. For a brief, staggering moment, cognitive dissonance completely hijacked Beatrice and Richard. The undeniable medical proof of their son being 100% sterile was literally clutched in Richard's trembling hand. Yet the sight of a young pregnant woman declaring she carried the Kensington heir overrode every logical circuit in their status-obsessed brains. Beatrice let out a piercing shriek of absolute delight. She shoved her chair back, ignoring the broken crystal crunching beneath her expensive shoes, and rushed toward Brittany. "Oh my goodness!" Beatrice squealed, throwing her arms wide open. "A baby! A real Kensington baby! We are going to be grandparents!" She grabbed Brittany by the shoulders and pulled her into a tight, dramatic embrace, acting as if they had been best friends for years, rather than complete strangers meeting in the middle of a destroyed dining room. Richard let out a massive, booming sigh of relief. He tossed the damning medical file back onto the gravy-stained table with a triumphant scoff. "I knew those documents were fake," Richard declared, pointing a thick, arrogant finger directly at my face. "I knew my son was perfectly healthy. You almost had us fooled with your pathetic forged paperwork, Natalie. You thought you could destroy Preston with a fake infertility diagnosis, but the truth just walked right through our front door." He turned to his son, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "Well done, Preston. You finally found a woman who can do her job properly." Preston did not look proud. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He stood completely paralyzed, his eyes bulging as he stared at Brittany's 4-month pregnant belly. I glanced over at Naomi. My brilliant best friend met my gaze, and neither of us could contain it any longer. A soft chuckle escaped my lips, followed by a louder giggle from Naomi. Within 5 seconds, we were both laughing out loud. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was deep, genuine, uncontrollable laughter that echoed wildly off the high ceilings of the lavish estate. We laughed so hard that tears genuinely started gathering in the corners of my eyes. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of this wealthy, arrogant family, celebrating a biological impossibility, was the funniest thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Beatrice immediately stopped hugging the mistress. She spun around, her face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. "What on earth is so funny?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with fresh anger. "Your petty jealousy is showing, Natalie. You are just bitter because another woman is giving my son the beautiful child you never could. Stop laughing right now. It is pathetic." Jamal, sitting quietly at the table, let out a deep, booming chuckle of his own, finally realizing the glorious punchline to this twisted joke. Naomi wiped a tear of mirth from her cheek and took a slow step forward. She walked right past the furious matriarch and marched directly back to the dining table. She reached out and tapped her manicured index finger hard against the medical file Richard had so casually discarded. "Richard, you really need to learn how to read official diagnostic reports before you start celebrating your genetic legacy," Naomi instructed, her voice dripping with lethal condescension. Azoospermia is not a low sperm count. It is not a sluggish motility issue. It means zero, null, absolute biological zero. Preston does not produce a single viable sperm cell. He is completely, totally, and permanently sterile. It would take an actual, literal act of divine intervention for your son to impregnate a woman organically. Naomi turned her sharp gaze toward Brittany, who was now looking extremely confused and suddenly very defensive. "So unless the young lady standing in your foyer is currently carrying the second coming, that child does not belong to Preston." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Richard stared at Naomi, his arrogant smirk melting off his face as the scientific reality finally penetrated his thick skull. He looked down at the medical papers, his eyes scanning the bold black text that clearly stated the irreversible nature of his son's condition. The room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence once again. The horrific realization hit Preston like a freight train slamming into a brick wall. His eyes darted from the medical file on the table to the rounded curve of Brittany's velvet dress. He knew the truth. He had sat in those cold medical offices 4 years ago and listened to the top specialists tell him he would never father a child. He knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that his biology was broken. Preston took a slow step toward his mistress. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. "Brittany," he whispered, his voice cracking violently under the weight of his collapsing world. "Tell me, who is the father?" Brittany took a step backward, her confident facade shattering instantly. She wrapped her arms defensively around her pregnant belly. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice pitching higher in sudden panic. "It is your baby. We did this together. You promised me we were going to be a family." "Stop lying to me." Preston screamed, the sudden volume making his mother and mistress jump. "I am sterile. I have been sterile for years. I cannot have children. I never could. Who is the father of that baby?" Brittany stared at him, her eyes wide as the promise of a payout evaporated. Preston dropped to his knees right there in the grand foyer, surrounded by spilled wine, broken glass, and the absolute ruins of his deceitful life. He had destroyed his marriage, subjected me to years of medical torture, and allowed his family to hate me, all to protect a fragile male ego that had just been utterly obliterated by a gold-digging mistress carrying another man's child. The devastating silence that blanketed the ruined dining room was swiftly broken by the crisp rustle of thick paper. Naomi was not finished. She reached back into the heavy brown envelope and smoothly extracted the next stack of documents. Her movements were highly calculated, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the people who had spent the last 5 years making my life a living hell. She tossed a thick, glossy photograph onto the table right beside the medical file. Then she tossed another. And another. Soon, a dozen high-resolution images were spread out across the gravy-stained mahogany surface, forming a picturesque collage of absolute betrayal. I stepped forward to examine them, even though I already knew exactly what they depicted. My private investigators had done an exceptionally thorough job over the past 2 months. Preston remained on his knees on the floor, staring blankly at the scattered photographs. Richard leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he took in the undeniable visual evidence. The pictures displayed Brittany in various highly compromising situations with a heavily muscled, heavily tattooed young man. They were captured kissing passionately outside a local coffee shop, walking hand in hand out of a budget apartment complex, and loading groceries into the trunk of a cheap sedan. "He looks remarkably fit," Naomi noted, her voice echoing with lethal sarcasm. "Let me introduce you to the real father of the next Kensington heir. His name is Chad. He is a 24-year-old personal trainer at the luxury fitness club Preston pays for every month. From the look of these time-stamped surveillance photos, Chad has been putting in a lot of overtime with your pregnant mistress." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest as if she were experiencing a sudden heart attack. She looked from the glossy photos to Brittany, her face contorting with absolute disgust. "You tramp?" Beatrice hissed, her aristocratic facade completely crumbling. "You brought another man-bastard into my home and tried to pass it off as our elite bloodline. You disgusting little fraud." Naomi did not give Brittany a chance to defend herself. She pulled out a secondary stack of papers, this one consisting of detailed banking statements and credit card transaction logs. "But wait," Naomi interrupted smoothly. "The story gets even better. Not only is Chad providing the biological material that your son physically cannot produce, but your son is actually financing Chad's entire lifestyle. These financial records show that Preston has been funneling thousands of dollars into Brittany's bank account, under the guise of living expenses. Brittany has then been turning around and using that exact same money to pay Chad rent, buy him expensive designer watches, and fund their romantic weekend getaways. Preston has effectively been paying another man to impregnate his mistress." The sheer humiliation of the situation finally penetrated Preston's shock. He let out a gut-wrenching sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. Brittany realized her grand extortion plan was rapidly going up in flames. The promised luxury mansion, the massive monthly payouts, the elite social status, it was all vanishing right before her eyes. Panic completely overtook her. She stepped away from the kneeling Preston, her face flushing an angry defensive red. "This is a setup," Brittany screamed, pointing a frantic finger at Naomi and me. "You two planned this entire thing. Those photos are completely photoshopped. That medical file is a total fake. Preston is the father of my baby. He promised me. He promised he would leave his barren, useless wife and take care of me forever. I have rights." Brittany crossed her arms over her chest, trying to project an aura of authority she simply did not possess. "I am not leaving here until I get what was promised to me," she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "Preston told me we were getting married. He told me he was cutting his wife out of his life without a single penny so he could afford to buy us a house in the hills. We had an agreed-upon child support arrangement. I want my money right now, or I am calling the press and telling them all about the pathetic Kensington family and their broken, impotent son. I will ruin your precious reputation." The sheer audacity of her demands finally forced Preston to look up. His face was streaked with tears, his expensive cashmere sweater stained and ruined. He looked at the young, greedy woman he had thrown his entire marriage away for. He saw the cold, calculating look in her eyes, the utter lack of love or affection. He realized in that agonizing moment that she did not care about him at all. She never had. He was nothing but a walking bank account to her, a gullible, desperate fool she could easily manipulate to fund her life with a younger, attractive personal trainer. The crushing weight of his monumental stupidity finally broke him completely. He had actively destroyed a 5-year marriage with a woman who had faithfully stood by him. He had happily subjected his loyal wife to years of horrific, agonizing medical procedures just to hide his own biological shortcomings. He had allowed his cruel, narcissistic parents to emotionally torture me simply to protect his fragile ego. And he had done it all for a blatant, manipulative scam. He let out a loud, pathetic wail of pure agony, a sound of absolute, irrevocable defeat that filled the large dining room. He curled into a tight ball on the hardwood floor, weeping uncontrollably as the dark reality of his permanently ruined life finally crushed him entirely. He knew he had lost absolutely everything today. He had traded his entire future for an empty, destructive lie that would haunt his miserable family forever. He wept bitterly, knowing that he alone was responsible for the total annihilation of his own perfect little world tonight, and forever without any real mercy. The sound of Preston sobbing on the Persian rug was eclipsed by a violent crash. Richard Kensington had reached his absolute breaking point. Humiliated by the grotesque circus unfolding in his dining room, the patriarch slammed his fists onto the mahogany table with enough force to shatter the remaining crystal goblets. Richard's face was a terrifying shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against the stiff collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He loomed over the table, his broad shoulders heaving with furious breaths. The pristine image of his elite family had just been dismantled and dragged through the mud in 20 minutes, and his fragile ego could not process the devastation. He looked down at his weeping son, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Get up off the floor, you pathetic excuse for a man!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Preston flinched, curling tighter into a ball, refusing to look his furious father in the eye. "You are a complete disgrace to the Kensington name," Richard continued, his words striking like physical blows. "I spent my entire life building an empire, cultivating a legacy of strength, only to hand it over to a weak, sterile coward who lets a cheap mistress and a gold-digging wife make a mockery of us all. You allowed this trash into my home. You allowed them to disrespect me at my Thanksgiving table. I am completely done with you. You are stripped of your title at the company. I have no son. I am formally disowning you, Preston. You are entirely on your own." Beatrice let out a horrified gasp, reaching out to grab her husband's arm. "Richard, no," she pleaded, her voice trembling with panic. "He is our only boy. You cannot just cut him off. He made a mistake. Do not speak to me." Richard snapped violently, pulling his arm away from his wife's grasp. He glared at Beatrice with a chilling fury that instantly silenced her. "You babied him his entire life. You turned him into this spineless, sniveling weakling lying on the floor. This is your fault as much as his. Now keep your mouth shut before I decide to throw you out along with him." With his wife and son effectively neutralized, Richard turned his blazing, hateful glare toward the two women standing near the foyer archway. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Brittany, who had pressed her back against the wall, clutching her velvet dress in fear. "You," Richard snarled, "get your greedy, deceitful hands off my property. You are nothing but a common street rat trying to extort money from a family far above your station. If you are not out of my house in 10 seconds, I will have my security team drag you out by your hair and throw you onto the street. And if you ever try to contact my family or demand a single penny of child support for that bastard child you are carrying, I will unleash a team of corporate lawyers who will bury you so deep you will never see daylight again. Now get out." Brittany did not need to be told twice. The promise of a luxurious mansion and endless wealth had completely evaporated, replaced by the terrifying reality of a furious billionaire threatening to destroy her life. She scrambled backward, abandoning her high heels to run faster, and bolted out the front door, slamming it shut behind her. The heavy oak door echoed with a final, definitive thud. Richard then turned his attention entirely to me. He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket, desperately trying to reclaim his aura of absolute supremacy and intimidating power. He looked down his nose at me, his lip curling into a cruel, arrogant sneer. "And you, Natalie," Richard growled, taking a slow, menacing step toward me. "You think you are so clever. You think bringing your aggressive little lawyer friend here to drop medical files on my table makes you a winner. You think exposing my son's secret gives you some kind of leverage over me. You are nothing. You are a nobody from a mediocre background who got lucky marrying into royalty. You signed those divorce papers tonight, and that is the only reality that matters. You legally forfeited everything. You are leaving this house with absolutely zero. You have no claim to my money, my assets, or my family name. Get out of my mansion immediately." Richard puffed out his chest, his arrogance inflating as he began to boast about his vast, untouchable empire. "Look around you, Natalie," he commanded, gesturing widely at the lavish dining room, the crystal chandeliers and the imported art lining the walls. "This estate is worth $4 million. My luxury supply chain company generates tens of millions in revenue every single quarter. I control international shipping routes. I dine with senators and board members. I am a titan of industry. I am a Kensington. We are untouchable. We own this city, and we own the people in it. You are nothing but a temporary pest that I am swatting away." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing, arrogant whisper intended to crush my spirit entirely. "Tomorrow morning I will wake up in my massive estate. I will drive my imported luxury car to my corner office. I will continue to rule my empire and live a life of absolute privilege. And what will you do, Natalie? You will go back to your pathetic, cheap bookkeeping job. You will crunch numbers for local restaurants and dry cleaners making pennies while you struggle to pay rent on some miserable apartment. You will fade back into the complete obscurity you came from. You played your little hand tonight, but you still lost everything. You are a failure. Now take your briefcase, take your obnoxious friend, and get the hell out of my sight before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The echo of Richard's threat hung in the ruined dining room, completely hollow. He stood waiting for me to run away in shame. Instead, the room remained dead silent. I did not flinch or move toward the door. I simply looked at my best friend. Naomi met my gaze, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. It was the kind of smile that made opposing counsel sweat in a crowded federal courtroom. She reached into the brown envelope one final time. Her manicured hand grasped the heaviest stack of legal paper yet. With a loud, resonant thud, she dropped the massive bundle directly in front of Richard's clenched fists. The bold black letters stamped across the top of the first page were impossible to miss. They read, "Deed of Trust," in glaring uppercase font. Right beneath it, another equally thick document bore the header, "Notice of Debt Assignment." Richard stared down at the complex legal jargon, his arrogant sneer faltering. His panicked brain struggled to process why a low-level divorce attorney would bring property deeds to a holiday dinner. He squinted at the crisp papers, trying to make sense of the official bank seals and the prominent red ink that marked the files as fully executed and legally binding. "What is this absolute ridiculous garbage?" Richard demanded, his voice suddenly losing a significant fraction of its booming certainty. "More forged trash from your pathetic little rented office. Are you seriously trying to claim you want half of my glorious estate in the divorce settlement? I told you earlier you signed away everything. You get absolutely nothing from my wealthy family today or ever." I took a deliberate step forward, stepping out of the shadow of the obedient, submissive daughter-in-law I had played for 5 long years. The mousy, quiet demeanor I had cultivated vanished instantly into thin air. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders, projecting the absolute, unwavering authority of a seasoned corporate executive. I looked Richard dead in the eye, stripping away the entire illusion he had built around me. "I do not want half of your estate, Richard," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, metallic precision that made him take an involuntary step backward. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, because the beautiful fairy tale you just told about your untouchable empire is completely over. I am not a freelance bookkeeper crunching numbers for local dry cleaners. I never was." I ignored her entirely, keeping my cold gaze locked firmly on the crumbling patriarch. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a surgical scalpel. And I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Financial Recovery. We are a premier forensic accounting firm that specializes exclusively in the hostile acquisition of distressed assets, corporate liquidations, and massive high-stakes debt restructuring. I do not balance checkbooks, Richard. I dismantle failing corporations. I hunt down toxic debt, buy it for pennies on the dollar, and liquidate the remaining assets. Richard's face went completely slack. The arrogant red flush drained away, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His terrified eyes darted down to the notice of debt assignment resting on the gravy-stained table, then back up to my face. His mind finally began to connect the terrifying, disastrous dots. He recognized the name of my firm. Apex Financial Recovery was a notorious ghost in the corporate business world, a ruthless entity known for swallowing bankrupt luxury supply chain companies whole and stripping them down to the bare copper wiring. Naomi tapped the massive stack of legal documents with a sharp, rhythmic knock that sounded like a ticking clock. She is not just a highly successful CEO, Richard. Naomi added, her voice dripping with lethal, venomous satisfaction. She is the ultimate apex predator in the financial food chain, and you have been bleeding heavily in the water for a very long time. I looked down at the highly official documents, then back up to the terrified patriarch. Those papers are not forged, Richard. They are completely authentic, legally verified, and fully notarized by the state. I brought them here tonight because I wanted to deliver the devastating news to you personally, face to face. I dropped the timid facade completely, letting the ruthless, calculating executive take total control of the room. You see, Richard, while you were so incredibly busy trying to figure out how to maliciously discard me for failing to produce an heir, I was extremely busy conducting a thorough audit, and what I found buried in your private ledgers is going to absolutely destroy you. I stared directly at him, letting the heavy reality completely crush his spirit. You built your entire identity around this ridiculous illusion of massive wealth, I stated, stepping closer until I could clearly see the cold sweat forming on his brow. You bullied your own son into becoming a spineless coward who would lie about his medical diagnosis just to protect the fake prestige of the Kensington name. You allowed your cruel wife to torture me, assuming I would just quietly accept the abuse because I was intimidated by your glorious estate and your expensive cars. You are nothing but a pathetic, miserable fraud hiding behind empty titles. Beatrice tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing desperately. But absolutely no sound came out as she stared in utter horror at the terrifying documents. The absolute, undeniable truth was finally sitting right on their ruined Thanksgiving table, printed in dark, bold ink. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Financial Recovery, I repeated, ensuring every syllable pierced his arrogant, inflated brain. I actively hunt for broken, failing assets, and I tear them apart for massive profit to maximize the return on my investments. And tonight, Richard, my premier forensic accounting firm, has finally come to collect your ultimate catastrophic financial debt once and for all. Richard stood frozen, his chest heaving as the reality of my words crashed into him. The color had completely vanished from his face. He looked at the documents, then back up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I did not give him a single second to recover. I stepped closer to the table, my eyes locked onto his, ready to perform a brutal financial autopsy on the empire he was so incredibly proud of. Your luxury supply chain company is a hollow shell, Richard, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the silent dining room. I have spent the last 6 months analyzing every single one of your hidden ledgers, offshore accounts, and falsified quarterly reports. You have been lying to your investors, your board of directors, and your own family. Kensington Global Logistics has been secretly bankrupt for 2 entire years. Beatrice let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her pearls as she stared at her husband in horror. Richard, tell her she is lying, Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill with sudden panic. Tell her our company is fine. But Richard could not speak. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. He cannot tell you that, Beatrice, because he knows I have the receipts. I continued, pointing a firm finger at the thick stack of papers Naomi had dropped on his ruined dinner plate. When your international shipping contracts dried up 24 months ago, Richard panicked. He could not stand the thought of losing his elite status at the country club. He could not stomach the idea of downsizing his lavish lifestyle. So instead of restructuring the business or filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy like a responsible corporate executive, he chose to commit financial suicide. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the polished mahogany table, forcing Richard to meet my unyielding gaze. You took out massive high-interest collateral loans from predatory private lenders to keep up appearances, I revealed, exposing his darkest, most pathetic secret to the entire room. You pumped millions of borrowed dollars into a dead company just to pay for your expensive cars, your tailored suits, and these ridiculous over-the-top holiday dinners. And when those private lenders demanded collateral for their exorbitant high-risk loans, you secretly mortgaged this very house. You put a lien on a $4 million family estate just to maintain a fake image of immense wealth. Preston, still kneeling on the floor in a puddle of spilled wine, looked up at his father with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad, is that true?" Preston choked out, his voice cracking with fear. "Did you mortgage our family home?" Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, trembling croak. "It was a temporary cash flow problem," Richard stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "I was going to turn it around. I had a new contract lined up in Asia. It was going to cover everything." "There was no contract in Asia," Richard, Naomi interjected smoothly, crossing her arms and smiling like a shark smelling blood in the water. "That was just another one of your desperate, pathetic delusions. You missed your first major loan payment exactly 8 months ago. Then you missed the second, then the third. Your debt went into severe default, and those private lenders were gearing up to foreclose on your entire life." I stepped back, allowing the sheer gravity of his catastrophic failure to settle over the room. "That is where I came in," I announced, delivering the ultimate inescapable checkmate. "When a multi-million-dollar debt goes into severe default, those lenders look to offload the toxic asset as quickly as possible. They bundled your massive unpaid loans and put them up for sale on the private market. Through a series of blind shell corporations and secure holding companies, my firm, Apex Financial Recovery, purchased your defaulted debts." Richard stared at me, his eyes bulging with absolute, unadulterated terror. "You bought my debt?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I bought it for pennies on the dollar." I confirmed, my tone cold and merciless. "I legally own every single cent of your catastrophic financial liability. You owe me, Richard. You owe my company millions of dollars that you absolutely do not have. And because those loans were secured by the physical property we are currently standing inside, the collateral now legally belongs to the primary debt holder." I gestured expansively around the lavish, crystal-lit dining room. "I hold the deed to this massive $4 million estate. I own the imported art on these walls. I own the luxury cars parked in the driveway. I own the very roof over your head. You spent this entire evening boasting about your untouchable empire and treating me like a disposable, worthless peasant. You told me I would be leaving this house with absolutely nothing but my cheap luggage. But the irrefutable, legally binding truth is that you do not own this mansion anymore, Richard. I do." Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands as the devastating reality of their absolute poverty finally crashed down upon her. Preston remained frozen on the floor, looking back and forth between his bankrupt, deceitful father and his newly revealed, ruthlessly successful wife. Jamal, sitting quietly at the table, let out a low, impressed whistle, clearly admiring the sheer, undeniable brilliance of my corporate acquisition. "You thought you could discard me because I failed to provide a Kensington heir," I stated, looking down at the broken, miserable family that had tormented me for 5 long years. "You thought you held all the power because you mistakenly believed your bank accounts made you superior. But your bank accounts are entirely empty, Richard. Your empire is dead. And the worthless, infertile daughter-in-law you just tried to throw out onto the street is now your legal landlord and your absolute worst nightmare." Richard's face transformed from a portrait of pale, sickly terror back into a mask of pure, explosive rage. The veins in his neck throbbed violently against his starched collar as my final words echoed across the ruined Thanksgiving table. He refused to accept defeat. He refused to believe that the woman he had just attempted to discard like common trash had completely outmaneuvered him in the ruthless world of corporate finance. His chest heaved with heavy, furious breaths. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table one more time, making the remaining silverware rattle aggressively against the broken glass. "This is a massive criminal conspiracy," Richard roared, his voice hoarse from shouting. "You are completely delusional if you think you can walk into my home and steal my empire. This is blatant corporate fraud. This is illegal embezzlement on a federal scale. You used your position as my son's wife to gain access to my private financial records. You stole confidential proprietary information and used it to orchestrate an illegal hostile takeover. I am going to see you destroyed for this." He stepped away from the head of the table, pacing like a caged, furious animal. Beatrice remained frozen in her chair, weeping silently into a linen napkin, while Preston stayed curled on the floor in a puddle of spilled wine. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. His fingers shook violently as he unlocked the bright screen. "You are not a genius executive, Natalie." Richard spat, glaring at me with eyes full of absolute hatred. "You are a common criminal. You and your aggressive lawyer friend are going to spend the rest of your miserable lives rotting in a federal penitentiary. I am calling the police right now. I am having you both arrested for grand larceny and corporate espionage." Naomi simply raised an eyebrow, entirely unfazed by the billionaire's frantic threats. She leaned against the back of her dining chair, crossing her arms comfortably over her chest. "Please, Richard," Naomi taunted, her voice dripping with lethal amusement. "Dial the numbers. Put it on speakerphone so we can all hear you explain to the local police department how a perfectly legal debt acquisition constitutes corporate espionage. I am sure the dispatch operator will be absolutely fascinated by your profound lack of basic legal comprehension." Her mocking tone only poured gasoline on Richard's blazing fury. "I am going to make sure you never practice law again," he shrieked, jabbing his finger fiercely toward the screen of his expensive phone. He began punching in the numbers for emergency services, his face twisted in a desperate attempt to regain control of his crumbling life. "I will hire the most ruthless prosecutors in this entire country. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 2 decades. You will beg me for mercy when the federal agents raid your pathetic little firm." I stood perfectly still, watching the patriarch of the Kensington family self-destruct in real time. "Go ahead and call them, Richard," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But before you press send, you might want to ask yourself what happens when the authorities arrive and ask to see the original loan documents. The same documents where you committed massive mortgage fraud to secure those highly illegal private loans." Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, his thumb hovering directly over the call button on his glowing screen. That brief moment of hesitation was all the confirmation anyone in the room needed. He knew his financial maneuvers were highly illegal. He knew his hands were covered in corporate dirt. But his overwhelming arrogance blinded him to the immediate danger. He opened his mouth to shout another empty threat, determined to call my bluff. Before he could press the screen, a large, steady hand firmly grasped Richard's wrist. The sudden physical intervention startled everyone in the room. Jamal Washington Preston, brother-in-law, had finally stepped forward from his quiet position at the far end of the long dining table. Up until this exact moment, Jamal had remained completely silent, observing the absolute chaos with the sharp, analytical eyes of a seasoned professional. As a 40-year-old African-American man who had built a formidable career as a former government tax auditor and a current strict corporate compliance officer, Jamal possessed a level of financial and legal expertise that vastly exceeded everyone else in the Kensington family combined. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His physical presence and calm, commanding demeanor instantly shifted the chaotic energy in the destroyed room. "Put the phone down," Richard Jamal instructed, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the hysterical tension like a heavy steel blade. You are making a massive fool of yourself, and you are about to make a catastrophic legal mistake. Richard tried to yank his arm away, his eyes blazing with indignation. Let go of me, Jamal, Richard demanded, his voice cracking. This criminal just admitted to stealing my entire company and my family estate. I am calling the authorities to have her immediately arrested. They belong in a federal prison for what they have done to this family tonight. Jamal easily maintained his firm grip on his father-in-law wrist, forcing Richard to lower the phone. Jamal's expression remained perfectly stoic, completely unaffected by the older man, furious tantrum. She did not steal your company, Richard Jamal stated with absolute factual certainty. She outsmarted you. There is a very distinct legal difference between corporate espionage and a perfectly executed distressed asset acquisition. And judging by your frantic reaction to her claims, I strongly suspect her paperwork is entirely legitimate. With his free hand, Jamal reached across the gravy-stained tablecloth. He picked up the heavy stack of legal documents that Naomi had dropped onto the dinner plate earlier. Jamal began to silently read the pages, securing total control over the chaotic dining room right now. Jamal released his iron grip on Richard's wrist, allowing the furious patriarch to snatch his arm back. Richard rubbed his skin, but he remained rooted to his spot. Jamal pulled a pair of reading glasses from the breast pocket of his suit. He slipped them on and focused entirely on the paperwork resting in his hands. The dining room fell into a suffocating hush. The only sound left was the sharp rustle of thick paper as Jamal methodically flipped through the notice of debt assignment and the corresponding deed of trust. Beatrice held a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and her son-in-law. Preston remained curled on the ruined Persian rug. Naomi and I stood shoulder to shoulder, projecting complete composure. We knew exactly what Jamal was looking at. We knew there were no loopholes. Jamal's eyes scanned the intricate financial schedules, the corporate entity registrations, and the official notary seals. His background as an aggressive IRS auditor gave him the unique ability to dissect complex financial structures in mere seconds. He scrutinized the transfer of the loans from the predatory lenders directly to Apex Financial Recovery. He verified the digital signatures, the transaction dates, and the binding collateral clauses. After 3 minutes of silence, Jamal slowly lowered the documents. He took off his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and tucked them into his pocket. He turned his head to look directly at Richard. The expression on Jamal's face was not just disappointment. It was pure disgust. Well, Richard demanded, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the moment. Tell this arrogant woman that her little stunt is a complete legal fabrication. Tell her I am calling the federal authorities to have her locked away for corporate fraud. Jamal let out a heavy, disappointed sigh. He tossed the stack of official documents back onto the table. They landed with a heavy thud that made Beatrice flinch. She is not going to federal prison, Richard Jamal stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying sense of finality. Because these documents are completely flawless, this acquisition is 100% legal and completely airtight. Apex Financial Recovery owns your debt. By extension, they hold the legal deed to this exact property. You have absolutely no ground to stand on. Richard staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He bumped into his heavy dining chair, grabbing the wooden backrest to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor next to his weeping son. That is impossible, Richard gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I am a titan of industry. I have legal protections. A random shell company cannot just seize my family mansion without a lengthy court battle. They did not seize your mansion, Jamal corrected him, his tone sharp and merciless. You handed it to them on a silver platter when you defaulted on your illegal loans. And that brings me to the second part of this massive, catastrophic disaster. Jamal picked up the final few pages of the document stack and held them up for his father-in-law to see. Did you honestly think you could hide your financial crimes from a forensic accounting firm? What crimes? Beatrice shrieked, finding her voice in the midst of her panic. Richard is a respected businessman. He simply hit a rough patch with the international supply chain. Your respected businessman of a husband has been committing egregious federal offenses for the past 2 years. Jamal countered, shutting his mother-in-law down instantly. I spent a decade auditing fraudulent corporations for the Internal Revenue Service, Beatrice. I know exactly what financial desperation looks like on paper. Jamal turned his piercing gaze back to the crumbling patriarch. These acquisition schedules expose everything, Richard. You committed illegal cross-collateralization. You secretly pledged this residential estate as collateral to 3 different private lenders simultaneously, without disclosing the prior liens to any of them. That constitutes massive bank fraud. Richard opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but no words materialized. His jaw simply worked up and down in silent, terrified panic. And it gets infinitely worse, Jamal continued, his voice rising in volume and authority. To hide the massive influx of cash from those predatory loans, you actively engaged in deliberate tax evasion. You funneled the borrowed money through offshore accounts to bypass standard IRS scrutiny. You then claimed massive, non-existent supply chain expenses on your corporate tax returns to wash the money clean before using it to pay for Beatrice designer clothes and your luxury car leases. You defrauded the federal government, Richard. You committed multiple felonies just to pretend you were still a billionaire. I was trying to save the company. Richard finally choked out, tears of absolute terror forming in his eyes. I was trying to protect the Kensington legacy. I needed time to secure a new manufacturing contract. I was going to pay it all back. There is no legacy, Jamal stated, his voice laced with profound contempt. There is only a mountain of toxic debt and a string of federal felonies. Natalie did not just buy your debt tonight. She bought all the evidence of your criminal financial activity. She holds the ultimate leverage over your entire existence. Richard stared at his ringing smartphone, still clutched tightly in his left hand. The screen was illuminated, displaying the emergency keypad. He looked at the phone, then looked at me like a trapped animal. Jamal took one final intimidating step toward the ruined patriarch. He pointed a steady finger directly at the glowing screen of Richard's phone. "Go ahead and press those numbers if you really want to," Jamal challenged, delivering the ultimate devastating reality check. "But you need to understand exactly what is going to happen when those patrol cars pull up to your driveway. If you call the cops, the only person leaving in handcuffs tonight is you, Richard." The heavy silence that followed Jamal declaring Richard would leave in handcuffs was absolute. Richard stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone, the device shaking violently in his clammy hand. The illusion of his untouchable empire shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence. His thick fingers went completely numb. The expensive device slipped from his grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the ruined dining room. Stripped entirely of his power and empty legal threats, the patriarch of the Kensington family collapsed backward into his heavy dining chair, his chest heaving as he stared blankly at the gravy-stained tablecloth. The roaring billionaire was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man who realized his entire life was a massive fraud. Beatrice watched her husband surrender with wide, horrified eyes. The reality of their catastrophic situation finally penetrated her deep narcissism. They were not just facing a minor financial setback. They were utterly, entirely broke. The $4 million mansion, the luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, and the designer wardrobe were all gone. She looked around the lavish dining room, realizing that none of it belonged to her anymore. In the blink of an eye, Beatrice completely changed her tone, pivoting to a new, desperate survival strategy. Tears began to stream down her heavily powdered cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup. She clasped her hands together in a theatrical display of profound agony and took a tentative step toward me. "Natalie, please!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion. "You have to understand the immense pressure we were under. We were terrified of losing everything we had built. We made terrible mistakes, but we never meant to actually hurt you. We love you. We are family, Natalie. We can fix this together. You can help Richard restructure the business. We can find a way out of this nightmare." I stared at her, absolutely repulsed by her rapid, shameless manipulation. Just 20 minutes ago, she had gleefully called me a barren gold digger and celebrated the arrival of her son, pregnant mistress. Now, facing absolute poverty, she was suddenly trying to gaslight me into believing we were a loving, united family. "You cannot do this to us," Beatrice continued, stepping closer and reaching out to touch my arm. I took a sharp step backward, refusing to let her toxic hands anywhere near me. "Please, Natalie, look at me. You have a good, kind heart. I know you do. You would not put your own family on the street. We are your family. We are all you have. You are not my family, Beatrice." I stated, my voice as cold and unyielding as solid ice. "You are simply the people who tortured me for sport. You happily watched me inject myself with fertility hormones while knowing your son was completely sterile. Do not dare insult my intelligence by invoking the word family now that your bank accounts are empty. Your tears mean absolutely nothing to me." Before Beatrice could attempt another pathetic round of emotional manipulation, a desperate shuffling sound drew my attention to the floor. Preston, who had been curled in a miserable ball since the horrific realization of his infertility, began to drag himself across the ruined Persian rug. He crawled through the spilled wine and broken crystal, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. He ignored the reality of his own massive, devastating betrayal. His only focus now was self-preservation. Preston stopped right at my feet, dropping heavily onto his knees. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying, his expensive cashmere sweater stained and ruined. "Natalie, please listen to me," Preston begged, his voice cracking pitifully as he reached up and desperately grabbed the hem of my skirt. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I never wanted to divorce you. I never wanted to hurt you. They made me do it." He threw a furious, accusatory glare toward his weeping mother and his catatonic father. "They brainwashed me, Natalie. They constantly pressured me about carrying on the Kensington name. They demanded an heir, and I was too terrified to tell them the truth about my medical diagnosis. I knew they would look at me like a failure, just like they are doing right now. They forced me to slide those divorce papers across the table tonight. It was entirely their idea, not mine. I love you." I looked down at the sniveling man kneeling in the spilled wine. He was actually trying to blame his own parents for his decision to maintain a secret mistress and systematically destroy my mental health. "You have to tear up those divorce papers," Preston pleaded, his grip tightening on my skirt as fresh tears poured down his face. "You signed them, but they are not filed yet. You can just rip them up right now, and we can go back to the way things were. We do not need my parents. We do not need their toxic expectations. We can take your successful company, and we can build a new life together, just the two of us. I will be the husband you deserve. I will go to therapy. I will do whatever you want. Just please, Natalie, tear up the papers. Do not leave me with nothing." He sobbed uncontrollably, pressing his wet face against my legs, begging for a second chance he did not deserve. He truly believed he could just hit the reset button, magically erase years of deliberate psychological abuse, and slide right into a comfortable, wealthy lifestyle funded entirely by my highly successful corporate firm. He honestly thought his pathetic tears and desperate groveling would magically erase the indisputable fact that he had actively participated in my daily torture for 5 years. I stared down at him, feeling zero pity, zero compassion, and zero regret for what I had done today. I stepped back, forcing Preston to release his desperate grip on my skirt. He collapsed further into the stained rug, his hands empty and grasping at the air. I walked slowly back to the center of the ruined dining table, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The heavy silence in the room returned, broken only by the pathetic hitching breaths of the miserable man. I reached past the spilled gravy and the broken crystal goblets, picking up the damp manila folder that Richard had so arrogantly tossed at me just an hour ago. I held the folder up high, letting the overhead chandelier light catch the wet, wrinkled pages of the divorce decree. I turned my attention away from the sniveling coward on the floor and focused entirely on Richard, who was still slumped in his heavy dining chair. Do you remember the day before my wedding, Richard? I asked, my voice cutting through the tension with absolute clarity. Do you remember calling me into your massive corner office at your corporate headquarters? You sat behind your giant mahogany desk, flanked by three highly paid corporate lawyers, and you slid a different stack of papers across the table. It was a prenuptial agreement. You looked me dead in the eye and told me that no commoner was going to marry into the prestigious Kensington family without signing away every conceivable right to the Kensington wealth. You called it an ironclad, impenetrable fortress designed to protect your empire from a gold-digging parasite like me. Beatrice chimed in that day too, standing right behind your desk, nodding along like a vicious hawk. She told me that if I truly loved Preston, I would sign the document without hesitation. She said it was merely a formality because people from my background simply did not understand the complex responsibilities of managing massive generational wealth. So I took the pen your lawyers provided and I signed it. I agreed to every single draconian demand you placed in front of me because I actually believed in the marriage. I believed Preston would protect me. But you made absolutely sure that the contract was completely ruthless. You demanded total financial separation. Let us review the exact terms of that beautiful, vicious prenuptial agreement you forced upon me 5 years ago. I stated, stepping closer to the defeated patriarch. The clauses were explicitly clear. What is mine, and what is yours is yours. Absolutely no spousal support under any circumstances. Absolutely no asset splitting, regardless of the length of the marriage. No alimony, no shared property, no joint claims to any corporate entities founded during the union. You made it perfectly legally binding that if this marriage ever dissolved, I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back, and whatever assets were held exclusively in my own personal name. Richard closed his eyes, his face contorting in sudden profound physical pain as the horrifying realization of his own legal trap began to dawn on him. He knew exactly what those clauses meant now. He had demanded that specific language to ensure I could never touch his money. He never anticipated a scenario where I would be the one holding the fortune while his entire family plunged headfirst into complete, unrecoverable bankruptcy. I tapped the wet divorce papers with my index finger, smiling with deep, merciless satisfaction. You see, Richard, your brilliant legal strategy just became your absolute worst nightmare, I announced, letting the glorious, undeniable truth wash over the terrified room. Because of that exact ironclad clause you shoved down my throat, my multi-million-dollar forensic accounting firm remains completely untouchably mine. Apex Financial Recovery is registered solely under my name. Every single distressed asset I have acquired, including the massive toxic debt that is currently crushing your fake empire, is legally protected by the very document you used to humiliate me. Preston cannot touch a single dime of my corporate revenue. He has absolutely zero legal claim to my companies, my bank accounts, or the massive profits I generated while he was busy cheating on me with a naive personal trainer. I looked down at Preston again. He had stopped crying and was now staring at me with a look of total vacant devastation. He finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his loss. "And what do you get to keep, Preston?" I asked, my tone dripping with lethal pity. "According to the brilliant prenuptial agreement, your father demanded you get to keep exactly what is yours. You get to keep your sterile medical diagnosis. You get to keep the public humiliation of a pregnant mistress who used you for cash. And most importantly, you get to keep the massive unpayable debt. You get to walk away from this marriage with the exact same empty pockets you tried to force upon me. You handed me these divorce papers tonight, assuming they were my death warrant." I continued gripping the signed documents tightly. "You thought throwing me away would solve all your problems. Instead, your own arrogance handed me the absolute perfect escape hatch. By legally terminating this miserable marriage yourself, you cleanly severed any microscopic legal tie you might have ever falsely claimed to my business empire. You locked yourselves outside the vault." Beatrice let out another loud theatrical sob, covering her face with both hands. Her precious social status was completely obliterated. Naomi smiled warmly, thoroughly, enjoying the glorious legal checkmate. It is truly beautiful how the law works when you actually read the fine print, Naomi added, looking directly at Richard. Your greed built the exact financial guillotine that just executed your entire family. I placed the signed divorce papers back into my leather handbag and zipped it shut. The transaction was completely finalized. Your ruthless prenuptial agreement saved my life, Richard, I concluded coldly, but it completely ruined yours. Now accept your miserable, ultimate tragic fate. There is no way to escape the brutal consequences you created. Preston remained on the floor, his hands empty and his face stained with tears and spilled wine. He looked up at me with pathetic, bloodshot eyes, hoping to find some tiny shred of the compliant, desperate wife he had controlled for the past 5 years. He wanted me to reach down, pull him up, and tell him we could fix this monumental disaster. But that woman was entirely gone, replaced by the relentless executive who now held his absolute ruin in her hands. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but profound, chilling indifference. The papers are signed, Preston. I stated, my voice echoing with icy finality in the destroyed dining room. They are completely legally binding. There is absolutely no going back, no tearing them up, and no magical reconciliation. You handed me that folder to discard me, and I gladly used it to cut you out of my life forever. You are no longer my husband. You are just another bankrupt, deceitful stranger kneeling on my hardwood floor. He let out a miserable, broken sob, burying his face in his hands. Please, Natalie. Preston begged, his voice muffled by his trembling fingers. I am so sorry. We are so sorry. We can be a real family now. No more lies, I promise. I stepped closer, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards, forcing him to hear every single word I said. Do not ever use the word family with me again. I commanded, my tone razor-sharp and merciless. A real family does not deliberately cover up devastating medical secrets just to protect a fragile male ego. A real family does not subject a woman to 3 years of agonizing invasive fertility treatments, watching her inject her stomach with painful hormones every single morning, all while knowing those treatments have a 0% chance of working. You let your parents relentlessly abuse me. You let them call me barren, defective, and useless. You happily watched me shoulder the crushing guilt of failing to provide a Kensington heir simply because you were too much of a coward to admit your own biological reality. That is not love, Preston. That is profound, unforgivable abuse. And no amount of crying on my rug will ever erase the psychological torture you willingly inflicted upon me. A sudden, sharp scuffing sound from the grand foyer drew our attention. Brittany had not actually fled the property as Richard had commanded. She had been hiding just outside the dining room archway, pressing herself against the marble wall, eavesdropping on every single devastating revelation. She had heard the entire financial autopsy. She knew about the massive toxic debt, the fake billionaire lifestyle, and the inescapable corporate bankruptcy. Brittany stepped back into the doorway, her velvet dress clinging to her pregnant belly, but her arrogant, triumphant smile was completely gone. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She marched back into the dining room, her bare feet slapping loudly against the floor since she had abandoned her high heels earlier. She marched directly toward Preston, her eyes blazing with furious indignation. You lied to me, Brittany shrieked, pointing an aggressive manicured finger right at Preston's tear-stained face. You told me you were a wealthy, powerful executive. You promised me a massive luxury estate in the hills, a gigantic diamond ring, and unlimited credit cards. You told me your pathetic wife was bleeding your trust fund dry, and once you dumped her, we would live like royalty. Preston scrambled backward, trying to get away from her venomous fury. Brittany, please just listen to me, he pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. We can still figure something out. I can find a new job. I can take care of you and the baby. Brittany let out a loud, harsh laugh that sounded like shattering glass. Take care of me, she mocked, kicking a broken piece of crystal across the room. With what money, Preston? You do not own this mansion. You do not own a company. You do not even own the expensive suit you are wearing. You are nothing but a broke, infertile loser who paid another man to get me pregnant just so you could pretend to be a real man." Beatrice gasped in sheer horror at the brutal insult, but Brittany was not finished. She leaned down, grabbing the collar of Preston's ruined cashmere sweater, shaking him violently. "I am not spending another second in this miserable, bankrupt house," Brittany declared, dropping him back onto the floor with a disgusted huff. "Do not ever try to contact me again. If you come anywhere near me or my child, I will tell the entire city exactly what a pathetic, sterile fraud you really are. Enjoy your absolute poverty, you miserable coward." With that final devastating blow, Brittany spun around and stomped out of the dining room. She marched across the marble foyer, grabbed the heavy front door, and slammed it shut behind her with such incredible force that the crystal chandeliers above us visibly rattled. The heavy thud echoed through the silent house, marking the absolute permanent end of Preston's delusional fairy tale. I looked back down at my former husband. He was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the heavy closed front door. I felt absolutely no sympathy for his catastrophic downfall. He had carefully orchestrated his own brutal destruction from the very beginning. My boundaries were firmly and permanently established. There would be no forgiveness, no compromises, and absolutely no mercy for the malicious people who tried to break my spirit for their selfish financial gain. I slowly turned my attention back to Richard and Beatrice. They were sitting perfectly still in their expensive dining chairs, looking exactly like hollow, terrified ghosts. Their pathetic apologies and their desperate attempts at emotional gaslighting had completely failed. They finally understood that my power over them was absolute and entirely unbreakable. Tonight marked the bitter, highly anticipated end of their miserable, toxic family reign. The heavy silence in the dining room felt incredibly satisfying. I slowly lifted my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my blazer to look at my wristwatch. The sleek silver dial caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. I let a few seconds pass, allowing the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock in the hallway to amplify the mounting terror in the room. Richard and Beatrice stared at me, waiting for the execution of my corporate masterstroke. I lowered my arm, projecting the absolute authority of a chief executive officer, closing a hostile acquisition. "Richard," I began, my voice slicing cleanly through the thick tension. "Do you remember receiving a certified letter exactly 30 days ago? It was sent directly to this address, requiring a signature upon delivery. You signed for it yourself, completely dismissing the urgent warning printed on the front. I know exactly how you operate. You likely tossed that heavy envelope straight into your mahogany trash can without even bothering to open it, assuming it was just another desperate threat from one of your frustrated private lenders. You always believed your immense wealth made you untouchable by standard legal procedures. You thought the rules simply did not apply to the great Kensington Empire." Richard swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously against his tight collar. The sudden realization that he had ignored a highly critical legal document made him physically tremble. "That arrogant, reckless assumption was the final fatal mistake of your entire career," I informed him, maintaining intense, unwavering eye contact. "Because that certified letter was your official final foreclosure notice. It clearly detailed the absolute termination of your grace period. It legally mandated that you either pay the default balance in full or forfeit the collateral property entirely. And because you ignored that strict federal deadline, the deed to this $4 million estate officially transferred to my corporate holding company at exactly 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching the edge of the dining table to keep herself from sliding out of her chair. She looked around the lavish room, her eyes desperately scanning the expensive imported artwork and the antique furniture, trying to memorize the kingdom she had just lost. "You are lying," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of their new reality. "We have lived in this mansion for decades. This is our historic family home. You cannot just snap your fingers and take it away from us. We have legal tenant protections." Naomi let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly across the ruined dining room. Beatrice, you really need to stop pretending you understand the law, Naomi advised, her tone dripping with venomous amusement. You are not a registered tenant, and you certainly do not have squatter rights in a commercial foreclosure seizure. You are a bankrupt former owner who deliberately ignored a final eviction mandate. The legal grace period has completely expired. As of yesterday evening, you have absolutely zero legal right to occupy this premise. I nodded in agreement, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to the defeated matriarch. Naomi is entirely correct, Beatrice, I stated coldly. You do not live here anymore. In fact, by continuing to stand inside this dining room right now, every single one of you is currently trespassing on my private corporate property. You are illegally occupying a commercial asset owned by Apex Financial Recovery. Richard's face flushed with a sudden, desperate surge of panic. He looked wildly toward the front door, realizing the absolute, undeniable trap closing tightly around his neck. You cannot just throw us out onto the street on Thanksgiving, Richard pleaded, his voice stripped of its former booming arrogance. We have nowhere to go. All of our bank accounts are frozen. My credit cards are declining. We need time to call our lawyers. We need time to pack our belongings. You have to give us at least 30 days to arrange alternative accommodations. I did not offer a single shred of sympathy. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting. I calmly unlocked the device and opened a secure messaging application. I did not type a word. I simply pressed a pre-programmed alert button on the screen. The silent command was instantly transmitted. I slid the phone back into my pocket, keeping my gaze locked firmly onto the terrified patriarch. I already gave you 30 days, Richard. I reminded him, my voice devoid of warmth. You completely wasted that time pretending you were still a powerful billionaire. I am not granting you another single second of leniency. Before Richard could formulate another pathetic excuse, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung open with a loud thud. The sound echoed down the grand marble hallway, freezing the blood in my in-laws' veins. Heavy, synchronized footsteps marched purposefully across the foyer. 3 massive, highly trained private security guards stepped into the arched doorway of the dining room. They wore immaculate dark suits matching black ties and discreet communication earpieces coiled behind their ears. They had been waiting patiently outside the estate in a black tactical vehicle for the entire duration of this disastrous dinner, waiting for my exact signal. I turned my attention back to the ruined family, delivering my final, absolute ultimatum. You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal belongings, I announced, setting the strict deadline. You are permitted to pack your everyday clothing, your basic toiletries, and your personal identification documents. That is absolutely it. You will not touch the expensive artwork on these walls. You will not pack the antique silverware. You will not take designer jewelry purchased using stolen corporate funds. Every luxury item inside this estate now legally belongs to my firm as collateral compensation for your massive unpaid debt. The clock starts right now. The sheer finality of my command dropped like a concrete block in the center of the ruined dining room. For a split second, nobody breathed. The 3 private security guards stepped fully into the light of the crystal chandelier, their imposing physical presence instantly crushing any remaining delusions of grandeur the Kensington family desperately clung to. Then absolute and total panic completely consumed them. The polished, aristocratic facade they had spent decades meticulously constructing evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but frantic, terrified chaos. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Her meticulously styled hair was now a frantic mess, and her expensive silk blouse was stained with sweat and tears. She looked frantically from the stoic security guards to the stairs, realizing her entire identity was about to be confiscated. With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, she scrambled backward, her chair screeching loudly against the hardwood floor. She did not say a single word to her husband or her catatonic son. Pure selfish survival instinct took complete control of her mind. She turned and practically sprinted toward the grand marble staircase, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished stone as she rushed upward to salvage whatever expensive designer handbags and imported cashmere sweaters she could shove into her limited luggage, before my security team physically intervened. Preston remained exactly where he was on the floor, completely unresponsive to the chaotic exodus happening around him. He sat in the puddle of spilled wine and broken crystal, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, rocking back and forth in a slow, miserable rhythm. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring blankly at the empty space where his pregnant mistress had stood just a short time ago. The catastrophic reality of losing his marriage, his family fortune, and his fake heir all in the span of a single hour had entirely shattered his fragile psyche. He was completely catatonic, a pathetic, empty shell of a man who lacked the mental fortitude to even stand up and pack his own clothes. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity for the coward who had willingly participated in my emotional torture. Richard, however, refused to surrender to the inevitable. He frantically scanned the room, his bloodshot eyes searching desperately for a lifeline, a loophole, or a savior. His gaze landed directly on Jamal. The former IRS auditor was standing near the edge of the dining table, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket with a calm, calculated demeanor. Richard lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of Jamal's jacket with trembling, sweaty hands. "Jamal, you have to help me," Richard pleaded, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have massive connections in the financial sector. You know the top executives at the major regulatory banks. You can secure a bridge loan for me. We can leverage your clean credit history to buy out this toxic debt and get my company back on its feet. I will give you a massive equity stake in the supply chain empire. I will make you a full partner. Just co-sign a temporary bailout fund for the family. We are family, Jamal. You cannot just stand there and let this ruthless woman destroy us." Jamal looked down at Richard, frantic, grasping hands with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. He reached over and firmly peeled Richard's fingers off his suit jacket, tossing the older man's hand away, as if it were coated in a toxic substance. Jamal stood tall, projecting the absolute, unwavering integrity that the Kensington family so deeply lacked. "I am not going to co-sign a single document for you," Richard Jamal stated, his deep voice radiating absolute authority and uncompromising moral clarity. "And you are completely delusional if you think I would ever attach my clean name to your catastrophic financial crimes. You committed massive systemic tax evasion. You engaged in illegal cross-collateralization to fund your fake billionaire lifestyle. You actively defrauded private lenders and the federal government. I spent an entire decade building my professional reputation as a strict compliance officer and a relentless tax auditor. I am not going to jeopardize my legal license, my career, and my personal freedom to bail out a desperate, arrogant criminal who dug his own grave." Richard staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for another manipulation tactic. But Jamal did not give him the opportunity to speak. Furthermore, Jamal continued, his tone turning even colder. "You do not get to use the word family to guilt me into fixing your illegal mess. You and your wife spent years looking down on me because I'm a black man from a working-class neighborhood. You only tolerated my presence because I married your daughter, and you always made sure to remind me that I was not a true Kensington. You happily watched Beatrice abuse Natalie for years, simply because she did not come from an elite bloodline. You are a toxic, miserable old man, Richard, and you absolutely deserve every single ounce of the devastating karma that Natalie just handed you tonight." Jamal turned away from the crumbling patriarch and walked purposefully toward the archway. His wife, Caroline Preston, older sister, had been standing quietly near the entrance, silently weeping as she watched her family empire collapse. Caroline had always been passive, terrified of her father's rage, but she clearly loved her husband more than the toxic Kensington wealth. Jamal reached out and gently took Caroline by the hand, offering her the solid, unwavering protection her own parents had never provided. "We are leaving right now, Caroline," Jamal instructed her softly but firmly. Go upstairs, pack a single bag of your clothes, and meet me at the car. We are walking away from this sinking ship tonight. I will not let my family be dragged down by his massive crimes. Jamal nodded respectfully to me. I returned his silent gesture of mutual respect as he guided his wife out through the heavy front doors, now completely abandoning the toxic family that had never truly valued them. Once the door clicked shut behind Jamal and Caroline, the agonizing reality of the countdown timer finally snapped Richard and Preston out of their paralyzed states. The lead security guard, a towering man with a completely impassive expression, stepped forward and tapped the face of his tactical watch. "You have 1 hour and 55 minutes remaining," the guard announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Move." Richard scrambled to his feet, his knees cracking loudly in the silent room. He grabbed his weeping son by the collar of his ruined cashmere sweater, hauling Preston up from the puddle of spilled wine. "Get upstairs and pack your bags," Richard hissed, his tone desperate and hollow. Preston stumbled forward like a sleepwalker, his eyes still red and swollen, and blindly followed his father toward the grand marble staircase. The 3 security guards immediately split up. One positioned himself firmly at the front entrance to monitor the exit. The second guard followed Richard and Preston up the sweeping staircase to supervise their packing. The third guard marched directly toward the master suite to keep a close eye on Beatrice. I stood in the center of the ruined dining room, with Naomi quietly watching the complete dismantling of the Kensington Empire. It was a remarkably efficient and deeply humiliating process to witness. The mansion that had always felt like a suffocating prison of impossible expectations was rapidly transforming into a sterile crime scene of corporate foreclosure. Upstairs, the frantic sounds of drawers being yanked open and hangers clattering against hardwood floors echoed through the vaulted ceilings. I walked slowly into the grand foyer, leaning against the marble archway to observe the chaos. Suddenly, a loud, indignant shriek erupted from the master bedroom. "How dare you touch me?" Beatrice screamed. "Get your filthy hands off my jewelry box!" I walked up the first few steps of the staircase, just in time to see the third security guard calmly blocking the doorway to her massive walk-in closet. He was holding a large velvet box filled with diamond necklaces and heavy gold bracelets. Paused. "Those items were purchased using funds from Kensington Global Logistics," the guard stated in a monotone voice, holding the box completely out of her frantic reach. "They are officially classified as stolen corporate assets. You are permitted to take personal clothing and standard toiletries only. Step back right now, ma'am." Beatrice looked like she was going to have a physical stroke. Her face turned a violent shade of red as she realized her massive collection of high-end jewelry was staying behind. She aggressively shoved several designer dresses into a large leather suitcase, weeping uncontrollably as she was forced to leave her most expensive furs hanging in the closet. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Richard was frantically scrolling through the contacts on his cracked smartphone, trying to figure out how they were going to transport their luggage. He marched toward the guard supervising him. "I need the keys to the Mercedes and the Range Rover," Richard demanded, trying to summon a shred of his former authority. "They are parked in the garage. We need them to load our bags." Naomi, who had walked up the stairs to stand beside me, laughed out loud. "You really have not been paying attention to the financial audit, Richard," she called out from the landing. "Those vehicles are not legally yours. You leased both of those luxury SUVs through the supply chain company to write them off as executive business expenses. Since Apex Financial Recovery just swallowed your entire company whole, my client now legally owns those car leases. The keys stay here. If you want to move your luggage, I highly suggest you call a local taxi company." Richard clenched his fists, his jaw trembling with suppressed rage, but he had absolutely no counter-argument. He pulled out his phone again and humiliated himself further by ordering a standard budget rideshare service to his prestigious $4 million address. The next hour dragged on with relentless humiliation. The Kensingtons were forced to strip their lives down. They packed standard clothing into rolling suitcases, leaving behind oil paintings, Italian furniture, and the crystal vases they loved. They left with exactly what they deserved: absolutely nothing. 2 hours later, the heavy thud of luggage wheels rolling across the floorboards signaled their final defeat. Preston appeared first, dragging 2 black suitcases. He looked ill, avoiding my gaze as he hauled his bags down the steps. Richard followed closely behind, shoulders slumped, carrying a single leather duffel bag. The arrogant titan of industry was completely broken. Finally, Beatrice slowly descended the grand stairs, dragging 3 designer suitcases. Her pristine makeup was ruined, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. The rideshare vehicle pulled into the driveway, headlights illuminating the front doors. The lead security guard stepped aside silently, instructing them to exit. Preston and Richard walked out into the cold night without saying a word. Beatrice stopped right at the threshold. She gripped the handle of her suitcase, her knuckles turning white. She turned to look at me one last time, her eyes burning with desperate hatred. She could not leave without inflicting one final wound. "You are a heartless monster, Natalie." Beatrice spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You destroyed a beautiful family because you were too bitter to fit into our world. You can steal our money and our house, but you will always be a nobody. You will die completely alone in this massive, empty mansion." I did not flinch. I offered a cold, satisfied smile. "And you will be checking into a budget motel by midnight, Beatrice," I replied effortlessly. "Make sure you ask for an extra blanket. Now get off my property." The guard pulled the heavy door shut right in her furious face. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The massive $4 million estate was completely silent, entirely empty of the toxic presence that had suffocated me for 5 long years. I stood in the grand foyer, breathing in the quiet air, feeling an immense, undeniable sense of absolute liberation. My corporate security team efficiently secured the perimeter, ensuring the disgraced family would not attempt any late-night retaliation. Naomi simply poured us both a fresh glass of expensive wine from the Kensington's abandoned collection, and we toasted to a highly successful corporate acquisition. We did not celebrate a divorce. We celebrated a complete financial and emotional victory. We sat on the luxurious imported leather sofas in the main living room, listening to the absolute quiet. For the first time in 5 years, my heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The crushing anxiety I used to feel every single time I walked through those heavy oak doors was completely gone. I finally owned my space, my life, and my complete narrative. The narrative of the great Kensington Empire did not end that night, but rather unraveled violently over the next 6 months. The spectacular collapse of Richard's supply chain company sent massive shockwaves through their elite Massachusetts social circles. You cannot keep a corporate foreclosure of that magnitude a secret, especially when the high society gossip mill realizes the arrogant billionaire family has been abruptly evicted from their historic mansion. Preston attempted to salvage his own shattered reputation by leveraging his former connections to secure a new executive position at a rival firm. But Preston had always been entirely incompetent, relying completely on his father's nepotism to cover his massive professional shortcomings. Without Richard's powerful influence to shield him, Preston failed miserably. He could not pass a basic corporate interview, let alone manage a complex logistics portfolio. Furthermore, the humiliating truth about his Thanksgiving disaster spread like absolute wildfire. Brittany made perfectly good on her furious threat. Realizing she was never going to get a single penny from the bankrupt family, she angrily sold her scandalous story to a local tabloid blog. She explicitly detailed Preston's total infertility, his cowardly lies, and his pathetic attempt to pay another man to father a child just to maintain a fake inheritance. The absolute humiliation was entirely inescapable. Preston's former country club friends openly laughed at him. His prestigious social network completely ostracized him, treating him like a contagious disease. Last I heard, my former husband was working an entry-level administrative job in a neighboring state, living in a cramped studio apartment and spending his meager paycheck entirely on cheap liquor to drown his miserable regrets. Caroline actually thrived after escaping her toxic parents. Free from Richard, constant demanding expectations, and Beatrice's relentless, cruel criticisms, she finally found her own independent voice. Jamal's unwavering support allowed Caroline to distance herself completely from the scandalous Kensington name. They moved closer to the city, bought a beautiful modern townhouse, and started building a genuine life based on mutual respect rather than empty financial posturing. She never once reached out to her ruined parents or her miserable brother, choosing her own mental peace over a toxic bloodline. Richard and Beatrice faced an even more devastating and spectacular downfall. Jamal Washington, true to his word and his strict professional ethics, did not hesitate for a single second to protect his own flawless career. As a licensed corporate compliance officer and a former federal tax auditor, Jamal knew perfectly well that failing to report known financial crimes could permanently cost him his legal license and potentially implicate him in the massive conspiracy. The very next morning after the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, Jamal walked directly into a regional federal office and submitted a highly detailed, legally binding whistleblower report outlining Richard's massive tax evasion, illegal cross-collateralization, and corporate fraud. The federal response was absolutely merciless. The Internal Revenue Service immediately launched a massive comprehensive forensic audit into every single aspect of Richard's past and present financial dealings. Federal agents raided his remaining corporate offices, seizing servers, hard drives, and thousands of physical documents. They froze every single hidden offshore account Richard had desperately tried to conceal. The federal government meticulously tracked every stolen dollar leaving the ruined patriarch with absolutely nowhere to hide. Because of his flagrant criminal activity, the federal prosecutors relentlessly pursued massive financial penalties that far exceeded his original defaulted loans. The government systematically liquidated whatever microscopic scraps of wealth Richard had managed to squirrel away. They seized Beatrice's remaining jewelry, auctioned off her designer wardrobe, and completely emptied their meager retirement funds to pay back the defrauded federal government. Beatrice, the woman who had spent decades looking down her aristocratic nose at people from mediocre middle-class neighborhoods, was forcefully shoved into the exact reality she had always mocked. Stripped of her massive diamond necklaces, her luxury vehicles, and her exclusive country club memberships, she became a total outcast. Her wealthy friends immediately blocked her phone number, refusing to associate with a convicted federal fraudster wife. She was forced to take a job working the cosmetics counter at a local discount department store just to afford basic groceries. She spent her days aggressively applying cheap makeup to the very working-class women she used to aggressively despise, forced to smile, and offer polite customer service while her arrogant soul slowly withered away. Richard, meanwhile, was currently awaiting formal federal sentencing, facing a highly probable 10-year stint in a minimum security federal prison for his massive financial crimes. They had tried to break me, assuming I was nothing but a weak, disposable asset they could manipulate and discard whenever it suited their arrogant needs. Instead, they had unknowingly invited an apex predator directly into their home, and I had absolutely devoured their entire empire completely and permanently, without remorse. The warm summer breeze brushed gently across my face as I sat comfortably on the expansive stone patio of my newly renovated backyard. The oppressive heavy mahogany furniture and the suffocating dark velvet drapes that once defined the Kensington mansion were completely gone. I had spent the last several months entirely gutting the property, stripping away every single miserable memory of my former in-laws. The $4 million estate now proudly reflected my own personal taste. It was filled with natural light, modern art, and an undeniable sense of absolute peace. The sprawling, manicured lawn stretched out toward the beautiful tree line, no longer a symbol of arrogant wealth, but rather a testament to my own hard-earned freedom. I leaned back in my plush lounge chair, and took a deep, relaxing breath. Naomi walked out through the massive glass sliding doors carrying 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of incredibly expensive vintage wine. She wore a sleek tailored linen suit looking completely in her element as the razor-sharp corporate attorney who had helped me execute the flawless dismantling of a fake billionaire empire. She handed me a glass, the cool crystal feeling perfectly weighted in my hand. We raised our glasses in the warm evening air, the crystal clinking together with a sharp, clear sound that echoed across the quiet patio. We did not need to say a single word about the miserable people who used to occupy this space. We were simply celebrating the beautiful, quiet aftermath of a perfectly executed hostile takeover. Naomi took a slow sip of her wine and smiled, looking out over the pristine landscape we had legally conquered together. I looked down into my glass, watching the dark red liquid swirl against the crystal, and allowed myself a moment of profound reflection. For 5 agonizing years, I had deliberately chosen to keep my massive corporate success a closely guarded secret. I had allowed Preston and his arrogant parents to believe I was just a lowly freelance bookkeeper, struggling to make ends meet. Many people have asked me why I did not reveal my wealth immediately to demand their respect. But the truth is, hiding my financial resources became the ultimate flawless litmus test for their true character. Money and status often force people to wear polite masks. When you are powerful, people treat you with artificial kindness because they want something from you. I wanted to see exactly how the Kensington family would treat a woman they believed offered them no financial or social value. The results of that test were devastating, but entirely necessary. Because they thought I was poor and powerless, they felt completely comfortable unleashing their true toxic nature. They showed me their profound cruelty, their unchecked narcissism, and their absolute lack of basic human empathy. They felt entirely justified in subjecting me to years of agonizing medical procedures and relentless emotional abuse because they believed I had no means to escape or fight back. They mistook my deliberate silence for pathetic weakness. They interpreted my calm demeanor as complete submission. They genuinely believed I was a disposable asset they could bully, manipulate, and ultimately discard the moment I failed to serve their selfish agenda. But that is the fatal mistake toxic people always make. They assume that because you are quiet, you are defenseless. They assume that because you refuse to engage in their screaming matches, you are surrendering. What they never realize until it is far too late is that true power does not need to scream or boast. True power operates in total silence. It gathers undeniable evidence. It meticulously analyzes every vulnerability. And it strikes only when the trap is completely unavoidable. Standing up to a toxic family structure is one of the most terrifying and isolating experiences a person can ever endure. Society constantly conditions us to forgive our relatives, to keep the peace, and to sweep horrific abuse under the rug simply because we happen to share the same bloodline or the same marriage certificate. We are told to accept the gaslighting, the manipulation, and the blatant disrespect in the name of family loyalty. But loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own mental health or your personal dignity. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. I had to learn the incredibly hard way that my worth was never defined by a miserable husband failing to love me or an arrogant family refusing to accept me. My worth was defined by my own resilience, my fierce intelligence, and my unwavering refusal to be a victim in my own life story. I walked into that catastrophic Thanksgiving dinner as a woman they thought they could easily destroy. I walked out as the legal owner of their entire existence. I took back my power, I took back my freedom, and I took back the very roof over their heads. You must never allow anyone to manipulate you into believing you deserve to be treated poorly. You must never let a narcissistic partner or an abusive family gaslight you into questioning your own reality. Document their lies, protect your own resources, and build your escape plan in absolute silence if you have to. When the moment comes to establish your boundaries, do not hesitate. and do not offer any mercy to the people who offered you none. As I sit here today, completely free from the crushing weight of their fake empire, I want to leave you with a crucial reminder. Your peace is your most valuable asset. Protect it viciously. Surround yourself only with people who genuinely respect you and uplift you. Have you ever had a family member mistake your silence for weakness? Tell me your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more empowering stories. Thank you for watching, and remember to always know your true worth. The story of Natalie and the Kensington family offers a profound lesson on the true nature of power and self-worth. Often society conditions us to believe that success must be loud, flashy, and constantly validated by the approval of those around us. However, Natalie's journey powerfully teaches us that the most formidable strength actually operates in complete silence. For 5 agonizing years, Natalie endured relentless psychological abuse from in-laws who dangerously mistook her quiet, patient demeanor for defenselessness. They wrongly equated her lack of financial bragging with a lack of personal value, assuming she was simply a disposable asset to be bullied. This exposes a fatal flaw inherent in highly toxic individuals. They consistently confuse emotional restraint with weakness. By refusing to engage in their performative arrogance and dramatic screaming matches, Natalie protected her inner peace while meticulously building her independence. She realized that her dignity did not depend on her cruel in-laws' conditional approval, nor did she ever need to prove her worth to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding her. Furthermore, this narrative serves as a stark reminder about the critical importance of establishing ironclad personal boundaries. When the ultimate moment of truth arrived, Natalie did not offer second chances or accept fake, desperate apologies from those who had gleefully participated in her emotional torment. She proved that loyalty to a spouse or extended family should never come at the expense of your own mental health, self-respect, and security. Refusing to be a victim is an act of profound self-love, and true freedom begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who only wish to diminish you. If you have ever had to quietly rebuild your strength to escape a toxic environment, please share your story of reclaiming your power in the comments below.